In this lesson, we will look at the proposed cross-section tools. Our objectives are to show you how the proposed cross-section tool within Project Manager will allow you to create your design cross-sections. The proposed cross-section dialog box is actually a step-by-step process that kind of walks you through the definition of these specifications and criteria in the creation of these cross-sections or design cross-sections. So let's go into a MicroStation file and look at how these tools work. Now we're going to access proposed cross-sections from our Project Manager. So if we go over here to the top left-hand side, we'll select Project Manager. We will select our project. It takes us to our Project Manager toolbox where we'll find proposed cross-sections in the second row here to the right. We'll select proposed cross-sections. It brings up our run box. The run box is simply the ability to, or gives us the ability to go in and create different scenarios and not lose any of that information. So we're just simply going to use the untitled, the default run that it gives us, and say OK. It gives us our proposed cross-section dialog box, and we will look at this. Now, you'll notice that I'm in a file called dxs.dgn. This is simply a copy of my existing ground cross-section file called XS, which was called xs.dgn. So that is where my existing ground cross-sections reside, and I've just made a copy of that file and called it DXS for design cross-sections because my existing cross-sections need to be in the file where I'm going to create my design cross-sections. So, and the naming convention is simply up to you as to what you choose to call it. So let's look at our proposed cross-sections. The first in the list here is we have XS.dgn file. This is asking where would you like to draw, where are you going to draw your design cross-sections. And in this case we'll draw them in XS.dgn. So I'm going to go to this little eyeglass here, selection tool, and find the file DXS in my working directory, select it, say open, and it puts that information in here. Then it asks you for a tolerance, and this is simply a MicroStation connectivity tolerance, and I usually run at about 0.1. Our next area here is for our pattern lines. And if we look at this information, it wants to know where our pattern lines that we use to draw our cross sections are located and what the symbology is. So if I do a reset for all this, I have my alignment, which is main road, horizontal and vertical scale. In this case, I'm using 10:1. The DGN file, where these pattern lines are located. If there's nothing here, I can go to select pattern DGN file, select pat, it's where the pattern lines are drawn, say OK. Select all of these boxes, or whichever boxes that you feel is necessary to define this information, and I'm actually going to go into that file. I'm going to open pat.dgn. Here are all the pattern lines that I use to draw my cross sections. I'm going to say match, choose one of them, select it, and you'll see that it places all the symbology information about my pattern lines in my search criteria box. Then I can go back to the file that I was in, which is DXS. And the next thing it asks me for is existing ground. So I'm going to go into existing ground. It wants to know where my existing ground, or what's the symbology for my existing ground, and where they're located for my existing ground cross sections. And in this case, they're located in xs.dgn, and I simply just have to open that up, select XS, It places that path in this box, and then it wants to know what the symbology is for my existing ground cross sections. Now, although this is in DXS, these are just a copy of my existing ground cross sections, so I can go in and say match, select part of that line, accept it, do a display, undisplay, and there is all the symbology for my existing ground. The next is shapes. It wants to know, first of all, it gives me three options, all in the DGN file, by search criteria, and shapeless. All in the DGN file will go into the file that I define right here, and it will select every shape that's in that particular file. By search criteria allows me to go in and, for instance, if I have shapes for my main line, different shapes for my frontage roads, and then again different shapes for my ramps, if each of these are in a different symbology, I can go in and choose the symbology I want, and it will only choose those shapes. The last option is shapeless. Shapeless is done without the use of shapes, complex shapes, and is used for such things as widening jobs, where we would define our existing edge of pavement with one line symbology, and then the proposed edge of pavement with another line symbology, and then define the slope between that existing and proposed edge. But we're going to use all in the DGN file, and our shapes are in a file called shapes.dgn. Now we'll go to our next option, which is shape clusters, and we'll delete this one. And you'll notice that I have a scan button over here. If I go in and hit scan, scan will go into that previously defined file, shapes.dgn, and look for the information that's there. So if I hit scan, it goes into that file and finds this or these shapes. Shapes for chain, main road, the tie of zero, and associated profile of disc pro or design profile. If I select it, hit close, it places that information in these boxes for chain and main and profile. Then I can say add. It puts that information in the collection field, and I can have multiple definitions in this field. So I have to choose the one I want. Once I choose the one I want, I have other things that become active. We'll look at, first of all, typical. If I go into typical, it opens up the typical section box. It shows me different typical sections that I can use. In this case, it's mill and resurface information. But these are simply cells that have files attached to them in the background that when you run these, it will load all the criteria necessary to run this particular typical section. So you don't have to necessarily know what the criteria is or what criteria needs to be run. It's already preset in an attached file. I can run this for the whole chain, or I can do it by station range, which allows me to put my station range in these fields below this box, or I can run it for the entire chain, which means simply beginning to end. So I'm going to hit apply, and once you hit apply, it puts the information left and right, and then puts all of your criteria in this field for you. The other option is to go to the side slope conditions box and select define. And what that brings up is a conditions box that gives you multiple options here as far as our side slope conditions. We can do side slope left, which is the left-hand side of the roadway, side slope right, or if both sides of the roadway are exactly the same, we can choose side slope left and right. Now you also have four options here of offset minus side slope left and right, as well as offset plus side slope left and right. These deal with divided roadways with a median. And the side slope, for instance, the offset minus side slope left would deal with the left-hand side of the median, the roadway on the left-hand side of the median, and the left slope of that particular roadway. So when we have a divided roadway, we actually have two roads, and each one of them has two side slope conditions, left and right. That's what these are for. In our case, we're going to select side slope left, and you'll notice that I have the station options here. I can do station. I have options for less than, greater than, equal to, less than or equal to. And then I have Boolean statements such as and or. So I can do between this station and this station or this location. So it allows me to go in and very specifically define areas where I want these particular criteria to be applied. So I'm going to say OK. It puts the side slope left here. I'm going to go back to define, pick side slope right, say OK, and now I have left and right in my side slope condition box. Once I have these in place, these become active and also the criteria become active. If I go to add, it brings up a box. If I don't have criteria in here, I can go to select, go find where the criteria resides. For instance, on a server, choose one of those criteria and it loads all of them in that location to this box. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually pick a criteria to run. And the first criteria I'm going to pick is right of way. I'm going to place my right of way on my cross section. And I'm going to pick, in this case, right of way 01 and say 2 criteria. Now I have to add that to both sides of the roadway, and I have a left and right. If I go to the right hand side, you'll notice I don't have any criteria here until I select this and place it there. Okay, so now I have the left and right hand side, and I have criteria, right-of-way criteria loaded. I'm going to say done because I'm only going to load one criteria file at a time. My next two options are define DGN variable and define variable. Now the defined DGN variable or the defined variable are different types of variables that the criteria file needs to do the drawing that is required. Now the defined DGN variable is simply a DGN element that is drawn in a particular file with a certain symbology. The defined variable, on the other hand, is a value that the user will enter. For instance, a slope, a ditch slope, or a pavement depth. That is what's referred to as a defined variable. So let's go into define DGN variables. If the criteria requires a variable, you will notice that this little button is active. If I select it, it says it wants to know right away. So I'm going to select right away. I'm going to say 2 variable names, and I'm going to say done. So that places it right away in the variable name. Now it wants to know, where do I look for the right of way? And I know that the right of way is in a file called plan.dgn. So I'm going to select plan, say open, and now it wants me to tell it what to look for, what is the search criteria for the right of way in that particular file that I've just defined. So I'm going to turn all these boxes on. I'm going to open plan.dgn, do a fit, because I want to go in and define what the right-of-way is. And the right-of-way that I've drawn has been drawn in this particular file, and these lines right here represent the right-of-way. So I'm going to say match. Since I don't know what the symbology is, I'm going to say match. I'm going to select an element, accept it, and you'll notice it puts that information in these fields. I'm going to go display, undisplay, and you'll notice that it highlights the right-of-way. And I'm going to say add, because I have to add it to this collection box. If I choose this and go in and modify any of this information, then I'll need to hit the modify button to change it. So let's go back and look at define variables. And I'm going to go back to my cross-section file. I'm going to go to define variables. You notice that this box is active, so it wants to know something. It wants to know my right-of-way berm distance. Now with this particular criteria file, it also asks for what's called a right-of-way berm distance, which is a distance inside the right-of-way that will define what we call the max slope intercept. In other words, if I'm drawing a ditch, I don't want the top of ditch to get any closer to the right-of-way than this particular value. And so I'm going to say select it, say to variable name, say done. It puts that information up here, and I'm just going to arbitrarily say 1 foot for my right-of-way berm distance and add. Now you notice if I go back to this DGN variable, everything's been defined, so this is now ghosted out. And the same for my defined variables. So I'm going to go into plot parameters as my next option. It wants to know what symbology you want to use for drawing the top of your pavement. In this case, we've chosen the color gray with a line code of 0 and weight of 1. You can also define line text, station text, and baseline name text simply by coming over here, selecting these boxes, and then coming to the right, double click, and give it the information you need to define what type of symbology you want this to be. We have plot options. We have pavement thickness. This is going to be toggled off because we're going to define pavement thickness with a criteria file. Fill gaps between clusters means that there are gaps between our clusters, and we don't have any in this case. It's just a single undivided roadway. Our transition definitions deal with such things as parabolic transitions or different types of transitions. We're just going to apply the shape transition codes. Once again, intersect between clusters. There is no separation, so we turn that off. We want to process our clusters as indicated. We want to remove the skewed effect, which means that if an object in our plan view strikes or intersects a pattern line at a skew, it's going to remove that skewed effect when it draws that information in the cross section. We're going to process only cross sections with the existing ground, and then we do the pavement shapes also. If we had a drainage project that had been completed and we wanted to include that information in these cross sections, I could go in and put this information, fill in these fields, and it would do that. Now, once I have filled out all of this information, I want to go to File, Save Settings, to save all the settings, and then I want to say File, Run. Now it gives me an option to do a log file or to screen. In this case, I want to do a log file, and we'll just leave it at the default, which is temp. I want to pause on each cross section, which means I want to look. I don't want to run this all the way through. I want to pause it and look and make sure that everything works correctly before I go on to the next cross section. The criteria viewer is a tool that allows us to troubleshoot criteria. In other words, if we have an error that occurs in a criteria file or while running a criteria file, we can use the criteria viewer tool to actually let us step through every action of a criteria file to see where the error is occurring. And then we can disable the view update. So let's go in and say apply. I'm going to say apply. It's going to run this information, and it's going to place and bring up our first cross section, and we can see that we've got our our proposed pavement, and we have our right-of-way. Now in our right-of-way, we also have things, we have the right-of-way line drawn and the text. We also have things called mark points. In this case, this is mark point 111, mark point 110. 111 is defining the right-of-way. location, and 110 is defining our berm distance, which is 1 foot inside. Okay, so, and then as we go through here, if we move this over a little bit and we look at our pavement, as we step through this information, we can actually go through and look at all of this information, and we can see that everything has worked out fine. We have our right-of-way, we have our shapes. It worked fine, so now we can go in and say edit, undo other, all, delete that information, which deletes all the stuff that we've added but doesn't delete our existing ground cross sections. Now we can go back and add some more information. Now the next criteria we're going to add is one called Hinge, and what Hinge is simply puts a point for a starting point, as a starting point for the next criteria file. For instance, if we put in a curb or drew a curb with criteria, the hinge point would then be moved to the back of curb so that the next criteria file could have a starting point. And so I'm going to go to add, go down to the H's, select hinge, say to criteria, do the same thing for the right side, say done. See if there's any changes in the variables that are needed by this criteria. You'll notice that this is still grayed out, so it doesn't need anything for this as far as a DGN variable. We'll go to define variables and we'll see that it's highlighted, so it does need something here. And it wants to know slope text size. So what it's going to do is place the slope, or draw the slope text on top of the pavement. And it wants to know what size we want to use. So I'm going to select that, say to variable name, close this out, and select 1 as the text size. And we'll have to add that to the collection field. All of this remains the same, but since we've changed some information, we need to go to File, Save Settings, and then we'll go to File, Run. Same information here, the temp log. It will just overwrite the one that was created previously. We want to pause on each cross section and say Apply. And now you'll notice that we've once again drawn a right-of-way, and we also have our pavement slope with the text of our pavement slope has been drawn on here, as well as our pavement shape. So once we see that that has worked correctly, we can go in and say abort a run. We can go in up here and say edit, undo other, all. Gets rid of that information, and go back and add additional criteria. We're going to add one called surface to add our pavement depth. In this case it's called SRF04. Say to criteria. This is telling us that some of these criteria have embedded in them a location for another, for labeling criteria. We don't need that at this point, so we're just going to say to criteria. We're going to go to the right hand side. You notice it added SRF04. We're going to the right hand side, say to criteria. It's going to tell us the same thing about those labeling criteria. So once we have this information added, we can say done, and you'll notice that on the left hand side we have surface, on the right hand side we have the same thing, and now we can go and see, once again step through and see if we have any additional information needed. In this case you'll see it's highlighted. It wants to know where our baseline is. So I'm going to open up a file called plan.dgn where our baseline is drawn. We'll do a fit. And let's do a save settings. And let's zoom in for our baseline. and we want to go baseline, 2 variable names, which places it here. We'll close that out. Places it here. Tell it where to go look, plan.dgn. Tell it what to look for. Select all this information. Let's do a match. And remember, we're looking for baseline this time. So we're going to go select this element. And we'll go to the top up here. And we'll select this element, say match. Select this element. Once that's done, then we can go to, we'll say add, to add this information here. And we'll go to define variables and see if there are any defined variables, and there are. So we'll select the defined variables, and it wants to know what our pavement depth is, first of all. So we'll select these. We have to select them one at a time. We'll say pavement depth, 2 variable name. We'll give it a value of 1, just a foot depth. Say add. The taper width, in other words, at the end of the pavement, if we were doing, for instance, asphalt pavement, we may want to taper that asphalt out. In this case, it's concrete pavement, so we want that taper to go straight down. So if I put in taper width, say 2 variable names, we're going to say 0. We don't want any taper width at all because we're going to add a curb to that shortly. And we'll say add. And our scale, since our scale or our cross sections is 2:1, then our scale is going to be 2. And we'll say add. And done. So once we fill these out, our plot parameters are the same. We're going to say File, Save Settings. And we're going to say File, Run. Now you'll notice I didn't get out of this plan view. I don't have to, because it knows where to go draw these cross sections, and it's going to take us automatically into that file when I say apply. So I'm going to say apply, pause on each cross section. It takes us to dxs.dgn, and now you'll notice that I have a pavement depth drawn. It draws everything that was previously drawn, as well as adding a pavement depth. So once that's done and it looks okay, I'm going to abort the run. I'm going to do edit, undo other all to get rid of it, and go back and add additional criteria. So we'll go back to shape clusters, left hand side, right hand side. This time I want to do a curb, and I'm going to go to CB01. Type 2 curb and gutter, 2 criteria. Do the same thing for the right hand side, say 2 criteria. Close this out, say done. Let's see if we need any DGN variables. None needed. Define variables, yes there are. So it wants to know our berm slope. Now what this criteria file does, and what the berm slope is behind the curb, it will draw a berm. Okay. Now the berm slope, we're going to say 2 variable names, and we're going to put in 99 to 1. Okay, which means I want a very flat, relatively flat slope that's going to slope back towards the road. And I'm going to add that. And then it wants to know the curb berm. How many feet behind the curb do I want this berm to be drawn? In this case, I'm going to say we're going to put a 3-foot berm back here. And say add. Okay, all I have to do now is say File, Save Settings, File, Run, pause on each cross section. It runs that information, and now you can see that I not only have my pavement depth, but I also have a curb and a curb berm drawn. Now the last criteria file that I'm going to do, and I'm going to close this out, say abort the run. I'm going to close and delete everything I've done in that particular, say delete all. Okay, I'm going to add one more criteria, back to shape clusters, add, and I'm going to add one called slope. SLP, which is just going to draw a slope from the edge of my berm to existing ground. And we'll just say in cut or fill. It says draw slopes from hinge point to existing ground in cut or fill. I'm going to say 2 criteria. That also needs a label criteria that we don't have. And I'm going to do the same thing for the right hand side. Say 2 criteria. Okay. So now that we've done this, I can close this out. I can go to define DGN variables. Everything we need is here. Define variables. It does need some defined variables. And what this is cut height break. The cut height break is where it's going to change from the cut slope usual or cut slope max. And I have 2 different values that I'm going to put in for that. So the cut height break, I'm going to say 2 variable names, and we're going to use 2 feet. Add the cut slope usual, 2 variable names. Now since this is a cut slope, that needs to be, I'm going to say 4:1. Since we're going up, add the cut slope max. I'm going to say 2 variable name. We're going to make that a little bit steeper slope. We're going to say 3:1. Add the fill height break. 2 variable name. We're going to use the same 2 foot. Add the fill slope usual. 2 variable names. And in this case, since there's a fill slope, it's going to be 4 to a -1. Add, because it's going to go down. And the same thing with the fill slope max. We're going to make it a 3 to a -1. Add. So once we've done this and added all this information in here, now whenever you use the typical section, it's going to prompt you or put all that information in here, put all the criteria needed information to where you will have to go in and put this information in also, but the criteria will already be loaded. You won't have to go in and load this criteria yourself. So once we've done this and we've got the defined DGN variables, the defined variables are in here, then we're going to do File, Save Settings, File, Run. We're going to pause on each cross section, say Apply. And you'll notice that if we move this out of the way and look at our cross sections, you'll notice that we have all the information that we need. We've got our right-of-way, we've got our pavement slope, top of our pavement slope, our pavement depth, our curb, we have a curb berm, and we have a slope from the edge of the berm, the curb berm, down to existing ground, as well as labeled that slope. On the other side, you'll notice that we have a 3:1 coming up from this edge of berm. In this case, we're in a cut situation, and in the other side, we would be in a fill situation. Once this is completed and we like the way it looks, we can say take this off, pause on each cross section, take it off, and say continue, and it will run through the entire alignment and place all of this information in there for me. Say exit, close this out. Yes, we want to save that, and then we have our cross sections drawn. Now that concludes our session on proposed cross sections.